All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Joshua Cameron. Joshua, welcome, sir.
Thank you so much, Guy. I really appreciate it.
So Joshua is a combat veteran who specializes in helping those who are caught in a life of chronic pain, whether that be emotional or physical. He helps them heal through the healing, the spirit, and following Taoist principles of inviting flow where there are blocks in our energy. Joshua spent over 10 years in the medical field, from combat medic in the Army to pediatric medical research and data analysis at the University of Utah. All right, Joshua, welcome, man. Before we get going, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Okay, well, that's easy because I'm originally from Utah and I'm currently in Utah. Now, I moved around a little bit. At 19, I joined the Army, then spent 4 years over at Fort Campbell. If you're familiar with the Screaming Eagles, right? If you ever seen like Band of Brothers TV show with Tom Hanks, right? That was the Screaming Eagles. So that's where I was. And then, spent time over, overseas at, multiple war zones. And then after that, spent 7 years in Indiana, but then made my way back to Utah at the end of 2010.
All right. So how the heck did all this start for you?
So it's a kind of a long story. And so I'll try and bob and weave my way through it. But I think a lot of how this started was really by, you'd mentioned about my spiritual, path a bit. And in order to have a spiritual path, I actually started on an anti-spiritual path. And what do I mean by that is that, in order for somebody to be truly spiritual, they really tap into who they are and listen to their inner voice. But from a young age, I was taught to distrust my inner voice, right? And little things, I'm sure that everyone, if you're listening, and you too, Guy, I'm sure that you've experienced it, things like, hey, Josh, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, oh man, I want to do this. Like, that's stupid. Why would you do that? You should do what I think would actually make you money. So then it starts making me think, oh, so my ideas are stupid. Oh, so then my career objectives are stupid. Oh, so then I'm stupid. And the problem with that is that, when your intuition says, hey, you should do this, like, oh, sorry, I've already come to the conclusion that I'm stupid and I cannot trust my intuition, which ultimately led me to the Army. Because at 19, people are like, Josh, what are you going to do? You're an adult now. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I'm like, And so I joined the Army without any real idea of what I wanted to do when I grew up, right? Quote unquote. And it could have easily been perceived as a mistake. In fact, the 4 years that I was there, it was like, what did I do to myself? But what's amazing now is that since I have the grace to look back fondly at myself and not be like, right, to myself, I can then look and see like, oh, even if I was listening to other people and I wasn't trusting myself, I still put myself there willingly. And even though I joined, this totalitarian environment with an outrageously sized chip on my shoulder, that was still me. That was, still I did that, right? It wasn't the best environment for me, clearly. But what it did is it allowed me to create obelisks in time that I can then look at and be like, oh, hey, Josh, this is what happens when you get in your own way. And this is what happens when you think you're the smartest person in the room, right? I joined as an angry teenager, and it took me several years in my 20s to get out of that angry teenager phase. And this is what happens when you put yourself somewhere willingly and then completely resist it, right? Carl Jung says that which you resist persists. I resisted the angst. I resisted the fact that I was, in this totalitarian organization. So what happened? Well, then I was controlled even more. Right. Because if you don't follow orders, well, then guess what? Well, they're going to go ahead and start taking your money. They're going to start doing all sorts of things. And so it was a real benefit for me, though I didn't see it at the time. And so I think that was the start of it.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you sharing that. And, what you said initially about trusting oneself and listening to oneself is profound. I mean, it's huge. I think a lot of people experience that on a day-to-day. Joshua, to this day, I'm still struggling with, listening to my gut, listening to my authentic self and trusting that. And it's something I'm still working on. So you said you grew up in an environment like that.
Yeah.
Now, was that via both parents, or are you speaking like specifically in your home environment, or just in your cultural environment as a kid?
I mean, great questions. Great questions. Now, really both. And so in my home environment, right, my dad checked out when I was 2, got divorced, and then really didn't have a whole lot of influence. I saw him like maybe once a year, even though he lived like 30 minutes away, see him maybe once a year.
Wow.
And my mom was, in a, God bless her now, but, is a, flawed person just like us all, and was, drowning at the bottom of a bottle, and was married to somebody who was a tyrannical, alcoholic. And what I learned, at a very young age is that just like in Jurassic Park, the Tyrannosaur doesn't see you if you don't move. Now, the problem with that is that when I went to school, well, guess who gets picked on? The kid who doesn't move, the kid who's shy, the kid who doesn't stand up for themselves. So the very survival mechanisms that I employed to keep myself safe from the Tyrannosaur blew up in my face disastrously at school. So then that further instilled like, hey, I apparently everything I do is wrong. Mm-hmm. And so it created this animus between my, outer self and my inner self.
So you go to the Army, and how are you working through this in the Army, or what's your experience while you're there?
I wish I had the presence of mind to be able to work through it, but I just wasn't mature enough. I could easily say, well, hey man, I had no prefrontal cortex, right? So right. I was relatively brain damaged, so leave me alone. But I just didn't have the maturity, right? Because I was so caught up in this paradigm that I'm wrong. Well, then it just like a dog who's leashed outside all day long. Well, I snap at everything. Right. So there was a lot of innate trauma that was really bound up inside of me. It caused a lot of, mental, anguish and pain, and really caused me to be in my way quite often.
So how do things unfold such that you start to become aware of what's been going on and what is going on at that time?
Well, really, it starts off with, I'm a huge fan of Jordan Peterson. And even before I met him, I was really employing a lot of philosophies that he talks about, which one of those is allow yourself to do something stupidly. Right. I mean, because what the hell do we know, man? Right. And if I'm trying to do a venture, right, and I go out and I try it, well, if I give myself the allowance to do it stupidly, well, one, I'm not going to take it, overly seriously, when I fail, because chances are stupidity is not going to succeed, but it's going to give me valuable data. And that valuable data is going to allow me to be able to then say, okay, well, this worked, but that didn't. Okay, well, this worked, but that didn't. Okay, well, how do I then start getting more successes? And, I was working in pediatric medical research, at the time, Donald Trump became elected, and I was working around a lot of women, and there was a big uproar, and it really, it galvanized me to be like, dun, 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 look at me, I'm going to hop on my white horse and I'm going to ride into town, and everyone's going to be like, hooray, here's Joshua. And while I felt good, I did a lot of things really stupidly. And I was out there like, okay, well, what do I see working? Okay, in politics, what I see working is people say a bunch of loud things, and then they get seen. Okay, well, what if I try that and do a bunch of loud things? And what happened was eventually I got to a point where I'd be talking to somebody and be like, well, Guy, it looks like you don't quite understand what I'm saying, or in fact, maybe you disagree. So it must mean that I need to raise my voice a little bit louder in order to show just how right I actually am and just how superior my thoughts are. And so I really walked around a while with my head up my fourth point of contact without realizing it. But what it did is it gave me the benefit of putting myself outside my comfort zone so I could grow. And then eventually when I grew, well, I had to pop my head out of my butt. And when that happened, it really took kind of my world falling apart at that point, because, Carl Jung has this idea that which you resist persists. right? The very people who say that they are against authoritarianism become very much authoritarian, right? The same way that a NASCAR driver, if he doesn't want to crash into a wall, doesn't look at the wall, right? He's driving, he looks at where he wants to drive, because where we look, right, we magnify our focus. And wherever it is we look, well, that's the direction of travel that we're going to go in. And I didn't realize that until I met a man by the name of Peter Sage. You ever heard of him?
I don't think so.
So he's a serial entrepreneur. He's just a leading resource on consciousness, neuroscience. Just amazing guy, born in Leicester, England. And, I went through his mentorship and, had him as a mentor, and it taught me so much about my own internal design, why it is I do what I do, why I think what I think. And it was in that process that he actually introduced me to a mentor of his who I thought was the most bizarre person in the world, right? Here's this guy saying that he's this spiritual healer. It's like, okay, dude, you're a spiritual healer, huh? Okay. But up until that point, I was really tuning into Sadhguru, if you're familiar with Sadhguru.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so this Indian mystic that has, completely, diametrically opposed on the outside, at least, the way that we'd look, as, this white dude from Utah. But, he has this point that life is about experience, isn't it? Right? Because all day long we can sit inside our heads and we can talk ourselves out of it in experience. The same way that a child folds their arms and says, no, I don't like it. And then there's this frustrated parent like, you haven't even tried your vegetables. How do you know you don't like them? Right? Well, I just know. So here's this guy who I thought was bizarre by the name of Ed Stracher. And in my right ear, I heard this audible voice, right? Maybe it was my higher self whispering down to me of life is about experience. It was like, and it was in Sadhguru's voice. It was like, okay, well, there's a reason why I'm hearing that, and I need to check this out. And again, putting myself outside of my comfort zone, because again, here I am in a seemingly bizarre situation, and that allowed me to tap into more spiritual awareness and a spiritual path that I didn't even realize was possible.
What's really interesting to me, Joshua, as I'm hearing you talk is, you shared a pretty oppressive environment growing up, one that could have, I guess, seemingly from the outside perceived that there was no visible trauma, but there was obviously a lot going on and a lot of maybe we can use the word negative stuff going on that really, I think, impacted the trajectory of your life, your belief in yourself, certainly. And yet you also talk about this pretty incredible self-awareness that you have. And to me, that's I think it's awesome that happened. But how the heck where did that come from?
Great question. So since, ever since I was a teenager, I've been devouring, Aristotle, Plato, the Nietzsche, the great philosophical, geniuses. And in many ways, it was above my head. Right, especially reading Nietzsche as an 18 or 19-year-old, it's just like, I get that these are words, and it was almost like it was almost like a Zen koan. If you're familiar with Zen koans, yeah, because Zen koans don't really make sense as you read them. They're supposed to make intuitive sense as you read it, in the same way that somebody tells a joke and then you laugh, right? You just get it. And in many ways, I find this philosophy like that. And so it took me a lot of years of, reading, this is what I think that they mean. Let me go ahead and adopt that way of thinking and looking at the world in this lens. And then it, through, I guess, the law of attraction, I really attracted things into my life that allowed me, gave me the opportunity to see, hey, do you actually believe what you think you believe? Right? Do you actually know what you believe? And as I experienced these things, it really allowed me to look further into myself, whether I realized it or not, in order to really cultivate what it was that I wanted.
Wow. That's a really, I think, powerful position to be in. And I think a lot of us could benefit from having that kind of insight, looking at being aware of our belief systems, our paradigms that we're running or on a daily basis. All right. So how did you get to a point? First of all, let me remind everyone I'm speaking with Joshua Cameron. How did you get to a point, Joshua, where you said to yourself, right, I want to start helping people or working with people to help them along their journey?
So that's a slightly complicated question because I thought I was helping people when I was out doing my political activism. And what I mean by that is that I suspended and just kind of, forwent anything that needed work in my internal life. I just allowed my life to basically fall apart because look at me, right? That's kind of what the martyr does. The martyr says, hey, even though my life is falling apart, look at the good that I'm doing for you, which is complete BS, right? The idea that you change yourself and change the world is probably the truest statement ever. Because, if we don't put the oxygen mask on ourselves first, we're going to pass out and we're not going to be able to help anyone. And as much good as, whether I was doing good or not, if I'm not taking care of myself, well, I'm gonna collapse out of exhaustion, right? I'm gonna collapse because my life is falling apart. And so it really was the examination of my internal belief system, right? Again, who am I? Who do I want to be? And when I first started tuning into Jordan Peterson, right, the ability to suspend my disbelief in order to entertain an idea, right? It was Aristotle who said that it's a mark of an intelligent mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Right? Just because you say something doesn't, I can certainly be skeptical, but what if I verify it? Right?
Mm-hmm.
What if I don't just, fold my arms and dogmatically say, well, I think this is silly, therefore I'm just going to assume these vegetables taste gross, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like a little kid. And so, with that, as I started examining, who I was, Jordan Peterson had this idea that probably the best thing that you can do for yourself is to create your highest ideal of goodness of which you can conceive and then become it, right? Make yourself worthy of it by becoming it. And when I started playing with this idea, I actually had a vision pumped in my head of a podium. And that podium was obvious that it was at a church. It was obvious to me that church was a Mormon church because I live here in Utah. But I was like, well, wait a minute. I get from this vision that I should be speaking from the business end and addressing people. But I'm like agnostic at best and kind of thinking atheist. Like I certainly don't believe in an entity as God. How the heck am I going to be able to address, like, how is that even possible? And by, just speaking with some friends, come to find out, oh, well, that's interesting. Every first Sunday of every month, there's this fast and testimonial meeting that the LDS have that where anybody who shows up can go up and share their thoughts. Anybody, huh? Interesting. And so I went up there and started just sharing my thoughts. And by the third month of being there, I created an editorialized version of my highest ideal of goodness, which was Gandalf. But not Gandalf in the sense of, you shall not pass, which is awesome and all. But the Gandalf who shows up to hang out with hobbits that everyone else dismisses, sees them as useless, and yet the hobbits saved the entire Middle Earth because their love of life and their love for community actually protected them against the pervasive evil, which was Sauron. And so Gandalf's love for humanity and love for connection, right? That's what I saw as my highest ideal of goodness. And well, here I am.
So give us an example of the work you do. What does it look like specifically? Obviously, you don't have to use names, but walk us through.
Sure. So I have a client right now who came to me in tears. This person has been they got in a car accident 20 years ago. They, smashed their ribs up. Their ribs are still hurting from 20 years ago, or at least were. And now they had, bone spurs in their spine. Trauma in their mind, and a swollen lymph node in their body because their lymph system isn't working. She was told that her liver was blocked. I don't necessarily know exactly what that means, but just going off of what she was saying. And as I, was talking to her, first I have to find out, like, is this something that is just like a passing, interest? Like, yeah, I kind of want to heal, or, oh my God, like I need to be able to heal. right? How serious is it for you? Because, if it's not serious, you're just not going to pay attention. Right. And, almost like a football player who thinks too much of their abilities and they don't really involve themselves. Right. They're just not really that interested. They're not checked in. They're not listening to the coach. And so I have to find out, hey, are you even coachable? And then, as I do that, well, my modality is effectively, I bring people down into a deep meditation, get them, into an alpha state. I do record them so then they can go back over through the meditations because, everything is energy, right? This is something that, physics proves. In fact, Einstein's mentor, Max Planck, was famous for saying that, everything is consciousness. And, the more that we wrap our minds around that, then we start to realize and even see that neuroscience now is proving that the brain doesn't know the difference between imagination and actual physical, interaction. And so part of what I do is get through to their identity, right? There's three main levels of awareness. One is intellectual level, right? And you can think of like a smoker, right? There's literally no reason why a smoker should smoke, right? There's no reason why they should, suck in carcinogenic vapors into our lungs. So intellectual, right? We can know things all day long, but we're not necessarily going to take action, right? We can know what to do, but we might procrastinate. We can know what to do, but then we just may not do it. And then there's the emotional level, right? Take that same smoker and say the daughter comes up and says, Daddy, I really want you to quit smoking because I want you to walk me down the aisle one day. He's like, right. And then they crush those cigarettes and they throw them away. Well, that's great to be able to get you, out of your rut and get you actually moving towards a goal that you want to do. However, right now they're a smoker who's quit, which means they're doing what? They're resisting. They're resisting the urge to smoke. Problem with that is that what you resist persists. If you're at the gym and you're holding a resistance band, there's only so much time until your arms give out. And until you change your identity, and this is really where I help people get to, is getting to their identity level and remaking the identity that they want. Because once you change your identity, well, somebody offers you a cigarette. It's not, you don't even identify as a non-smoker. You just don't smoke. And this is the idea in the Tao Te Ching where, this idea of, if you give evil nothing to oppose, it'll go away on its own. Not because it's not there, but because you can step out of its way. Right. But if you're opposing and you're resisting, well, your willpower will give out. Right. Because, no matter what, the environment will trump your willpower every time over time. If you and I are hanging out and I'm about to fall off a cliff face, I'm holding on. You come back on Tuesday, I ain't going to be there.
Right. So for context purposes for our listeners, so you are a coach.
So I do coaching because I do need to make sure that you understand, or, proverbial you understand that, thoughts have power, right? And, our words cast spells on us all day long. And there's a very easy way to think of that right here in America, which I love the US, but we talk about how we are the land of the free, right? And so we use these words and we adopt them and we believe them. But if we're the land of the free with 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners, well, that seems strange. That doesn't seem very free, but we believe it anyway. And so, whatever words we tell ourselves, right? Bruce Lee was famous for saying that to watch the language that you use, with yourself, because your body can't help but listen. And if we are breaking ourselves down in the mind, right? In America, we fetishize this idea that we are our own worst critic or our own worst enemy. And an own worst critic or own worst enemy is not somebody who has your back. That's somebody who's going to come and hit you in the knee with a hammer right before it's time to run a race. Right. And so when we have these negative thoughts, well, these are all energy. Everything's energy. And, now neuroscience is proving that chronic pain almost always is some level of unprocessed trauma that's stuck in the body. And so if we are internalizing all these negative thoughts and we're breaking ourselves down in our mind, well, doesn't it make sense that the body itself would start to break down? So part of the coaching process is to be able to get people to understand your thoughts have power. Right. You live in a world where the world happens to you. Well, then you're going to get a reflection because the world is going to mirror that, hey, things are happening to you and things are going to fall apart. But when you start seizing that power back and you actually start looking at where you want to go instead of looking where you don't want to go, that coupled with the powerful meditations and, the effectively, it might sound silly, but, whatever. I help people heal their soul. And what I mean by that is, this idea of flow, right? We need all energy needs flow. And if we are blocking up our flow by, having these, traumatic ideas and thoughts constantly beating ourselves down, just like water needs to flow, the energy in our body, if it quits flowing, well, it starts to stagnate. And what's attracted to stagnating water? Well, parasites and mosquitoes. And what do they bring? Well, they bring diseases. And so what happens when these parasites and mosquitoes, attach themselves to our energy body? Well, just like they do in the real world. Instead of drawing our lifeblood, they're drawing our life force. And if our life force is drawn, just like Max Planck said, everything is consciousness, which is, a good placeholder for soul. Well, if the soul itself is being drained, well, then of course the body and the mind break down as a natural consequence. But the soul itself is now at full power, well, then the body and the mind, will they heal as a natural consequence. And instead of flopping our arms around and fighting these mosquitoes, which then gets the heart rate going, which then gets the breathing going. And what are mosquitoes attracted to in the first place? Our carbon dioxide output. Well, then what I do is I help introduce that flow through the coaching, as well as the meditations, as well as just healing the soul. So that way that energy can start flowing again, get rid of that stagnant energy. So then you're stepping out of the way of that evil rather than opposing it.
Now, in terms of help us understand how trauma comes into play here, because obviously there are a lot of different trauma treatment modalities out there, ones that focus on the body, somatic therapies, and so forth. How do you approach that if someone comes to you with an obvious pronounced traumatic experience, say sexual assault and so forth? What is your, and again, with the understanding that everyone's different, but how do you approach that?
I fell into that idea intuitively. And what I mean by that is, for, a while, I was a nerd. I don't watch as much TV now, but I was watching a lot of Stranger Things. And, on this Stranger Things, there's, this girl, 11, who goes into a sensory deprivation tank. And in there, she taps into a whole new dimension. And so I started playing with these ideas like, well, wait a minute. Well, I have access to a deprivation tank. I also have access to, quote unquote, magical abilities. Well, what would happen if I put myself in a deprivation tank and see what I can do with my magical abilities? And so what happened was, and this is also what I do, but I had to learn how to do this for myself first. But in this deprivation tank, I'm going through my meditations, I'm going through my energy work, and I'm feeling more love and more connectedness than I've ever felt in my life. And it occurred to me at that moment, right, that I should summon the worst, grossest memory of my life. And so I did. And so just like I was in a hologram in this new dimension, I went ahead and had it playing. And then I created the version of me that was at that age, right? This 6-year-old boy who didn't have a dad, right? Who basically was checked out, who, the only father figure that was there every day was this, maniacal tyrannosaur that's also drowning, at the bottom of a bottle of alcohol. And what I did was I then projected myself who I was then, feeling this ultimate love right next to that little boy. And I took his hand. And the love that I never got as a boy, well, I've learned how to give love to my son. So what did I do? Well, I gave the same love that I give to my son to myself. And I learned at that point that I can be my own father. I don't need to go looking out for the validation from my dad because I can give that to myself. And then what I didn't realize at the point, but then the Tao helped me understand what I did here, is that, I filtered that gross emotion through that feeling of love that I had. And then as I filtered it, then I passed it on to that kid, that child version of me. And so this is actually what shamans call soul retrieval. I don't know if you ever heard soul retrieval, but, so I went through and effectively did what they call soul retrieval. And, as I'm holding his hand, I'm processing this emotion for him. Right. And then I turned around and let him know, hey, you never have to be afraid ever again. And I gave him a big hug that he needed to feel safe. And I just bursted out crying. I made that salty water a little bit saltier, for a couple of minutes. But, and so that's effectively what I do is I don't go in there and say, hey, let's get rid of this memory. Let's go in there and save that person from that event. and let's remake, right? Because the brain doesn't know. Brain doesn't know any difference. So if the brain doesn't know any difference, well, let's go ahead and remake those neural pathways. And since we can remake those neural pathways, what are we doing? We're stepping out of the way of evil.
Share with us, if you can, an insight from when you started this work, an insight about an error you made, a clinical error you made, and what you learned from that, or a coaching error, rather.
Yeah, I guess so part of coaching is you've got to know when to lean in and call your clients on their BS, right? Because as much as people want to be able to heal, they're also going to fall back on the pathways that they're used to. And, people who live in a, life happens to me mentality need to get out of that if they're ever going to have any sense of healing or any sense of self-autonomy. Otherwise, they're constantly going to be giving their power to others. So there were times that I've learned that wearing kid gloves too often and just trying to be nice rather than just kind of drawing a line in the sand and not being rude, but being stern and say, hey, this behavior is not acceptable. Right. Because when you're new, right, you can get nervous, and it's, and when you're nervous, you want people to like you. Right. And so I would say that, being liked is far less important than being effective.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right. So who do you work with? Do you have an ideal client in general?
Yeah, a great question. So ideal really are people who, experience chronic pain that effectively the only hope that they have, is that, their doctor says, well, here's this drug that'll, going to have, terrible side effects, right? That 80% of addicts come from taking these drugs. And there's no real cure to this. And you have to keep coming in, keep getting checked out, maybe have surgeries because your body's still breaking down, maybe get, things replaced. And if they're tired of that, and they finally want to find a place where, perfect health actually is a natural state, and they're tired of actually taking something that just is a Band-Aid, then that's my ideal client. And that's, a chronic pain in the mind or the body, right? That's PTSD, that's depression, anxiety. I even worked with a young lady in New Zealand who couldn't help but pick these gnarly scabs. I mean, just pick her skin all over her shoulders, down her arms. So she could, she's in New Zealand and she'd constantly wear long sleeve shirts in New Zealand. As hot as it is there, just because, her, just the state of mental disaffection that she had for herself. She just couldn't help but see herself as an enemy and just pick these, gross scabs. And then after working with her, well, she's never had that level of self-love before. And because I helped remake her identity, well, then she stepped out of the way. There's no longer the need to pick the scabs because she identifies as, she doesn't identify as a non-smoker. She just doesn't smoke. She doesn't identify as somebody who doesn't pick their scabs. She just doesn't pick scabs anymore.
Joshua, what do you think it is about you that enables you to do this work?
Imagination, right? Einstein said that the mark of intelligence is based on imagination. And again, that goes back to neuroscience proving that, our brain doesn't know the difference between reality and imagination if we are able to visualize. And all throughout my life, as I was growing up, right? So one of the things that really saved me from the, oppressive, background that I had is I would devour a lot of fantasy novels. I devour these epic stories of people who had this camaraderie, this brotherly camaraderie with their fellows that I just never had. And so I identified with this idea, this magical ability to be able to find a path and to be able to identify, to be able to save myself and save others. And once I realized that, my master, Ed Stracher, once I realized that's what he was offering me, it was like, oh man, I'm all in. All in. And so my ability to trust in myself and then just believe, has shown, incredible results. In fact, the lady who I mentioned who had bone spurs, right? MRI now shows, well, guess what? Bone spurs are gone. So no need for surgery to get rid of bone spurs on the spine, right? And you can imagine how painful that can be, bone spurs on the spine. And well, how is that possible, Josh, that you brought somebody through a meditation and got them to change their thoughts? And then now bone spurs are gone? Well, because again, everything is energy and all energy can be transformed. Just a matter of belief.
Awesome. Joshua, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Yeah, for sure. So best way is probably go to my website at www.freemefrompains.com. And there'll be a button there that if you want to, get in touch with, live trainings, or the community, you can click that as well. And that'll get you connected to my Facebook page. And so that way we can stay in touch. I can, share some, resources that I've got, and, happy to chat with people who, are really looking for a change, right? And really looking for the ability to find that ability to heal.
Awesome. We'll have that linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your journey and your personal experience, because I feel, Joshua, that what you're talking about is at the core of a lot of powerful work that's happening right now. I mean, I'm thinking obviously of like Joe Dispenza and his work. And I think you're ahead of the curve.
Oh, thanks.
And what's happening in terms of therapy. Awesome. Love to have you back.
Oh, hey, I'd love to be back. I really appreciate this opportunity. This has been fantastic.
All right, man. We'll be in touch. Take care.
That sounds great. Hey, you too, man.